December 1940. In the freezing darkness of a collapsing winter, the future of Western civilization hung by a thread, and that thread was thinning by the hour. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the war was far from over. The Blitz raged on. London burned night after night. Coventry and Liverpool absorbed the hammer blows of the Luftwaffe. On maps, the British Empire still looked vast, a quarter of the globe washed in imperial color. But inside the underground war rooms of Whitehall, the men running the British state understood a truth too dangerous to share with the public. The empire was not merely bleeding soldiers, it was bleeding money, and it was close to financial death. Winston Churchill, the voice of defiance and endurance, sat down to write one of the most consequential letters of his life. It was addressed to the President of the United States. And despite Churchill's mastery of language, this letter was not rhetoric, it was confession. The empire that had financed the 19th century, that had ruled global trade and defeated Napoleon, was broke. Churchill laid out the military situation, the submarine threat in the Atlantic, the desperate need for aircraft and destroyers. Then came the core admission. Britain was approaching the moment when it would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies required to survive. The British people would fight on beaches and airfields, he wrote, but they could not fight without ammunition, and they could no longer afford to buy it. This was not diplomacy. It was a plea for survival. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached this point, one must understand the ruthless economics of total war. When war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial giant. Billions in gold reserves, vast overseas investments. British citizens owned railways in South America, mines, factories, and entire industrial networks across the world, including inside the United States. London remained the nerve center of global insurance, shipping, and finance. But this war was different. It was a war of machines. Steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, fuel, and food were consumed at a rate that shattered all pre-war assumptions. And critically, Britain imported almost everything. The blockade of Europe cut Britain off from nearby trade. Survival now depended on the United States. Yet America was officially neutral. Public opinion was isolationist, haunted by memories of the First World War. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts to prevent involvement. The key mechanism was cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons, but only with immediate payment, and only using British ships. No loans, no credit. Gold on the dock before the crates moved. For over a year, Britain complied. Gold reserves were liquidated, dollars were drained. In a secret operation, Britain shipped its national gold reserves and negotiable securities across the Atlantic to Canada, the largest movement of physical wealth ever undertaken. The treasurer of the empire went into exile to pay American suppliers. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The dollars were gone. In Washington, British purchasing agents had contracts they could not sign because London no longer had the currency to honor them. When the American president read Churchill's letter, he understood the strategic reality. If Britain fell, the United States would stand alone. But he faced a political wall. He could not simply give money to Britain. American law forbade it. Public opinion would revolt. He needed a mechanism that looked like business, not charity. This necessity gave birth to what would become known as Lend-Lease. Publicly, it was explained with comforting simplicity. If a neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him a hose, and he returns it later. It sounded generous, practical, moral. But behind closed doors, the reality was colder. This was not neighborly aid, it was a foreclosure. At the heart of American policy was a hard condition. Before receiving aid, Britain had to prove it had exhausted every asset it possessed. An audit of the entire British Empire was demanded. Government assets, private assets, overseas holdings. Nothing was exempt. Britain was not treated as an ally fighting for shared survival, but as a bankrupt entity under financial examination. British negotiators protested. They argued that selling long-term investments during wartime would be a fire sale, that stripping overseas income would cripple Britain after the war, leaving it unable to rebuild or even feed its population. The response was unmoved. If Britain still owned valuable assets, why should American taxpayers subsidize the war? Why should an American worker pay for British weapons while British capital still generated income abroad? The logic was brutal and transactional. Aid would come only after liquidation. This moment marked the beginning of a silent transfer of power. The special relationship revealed itself not as a partnership, but as a hierarchy. Britain would survive, but only by dismantling the foundations of its wealth. The empire would not fall by invasion. It would be sold off, piece by piece, under financial pressure. December 1940 was the turning point. The war had not yet been won, but Britain had already lost something irreversible: its independence, its leverage, its future. What followed would not be defeat on the battlefield, but liquidation in the ledger books. And this is where the real story begins. The demands did not stop at audits and confessions. Once Britain admitted it was broke, The real leverage began. Washington understood something London could not escape. Desperation eliminates negotiation. Every hour, German submarines sank merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Food stocks tightened. Fuel dwindled. Time was not neutral. Time was the enemy. And the United States knew it. Aid would come, but only on American terms, and those terms were designed not merely to save Britain, but to reorder the global balance of power. What followed was not charity, it was extraction. The U.S. Treasury made its position unmistakably clear. Before any sustained assistance, Britain had to liquidate its overseas wealth, not after the war, not gradually, now. The British were forced to sell income-producing assets in the United States at the worst possible moment, under maximum pressure, with buyers fully aware that the seller had no alternative. This was a textbook fire sale. Profitable companies that generated vital dollar income were marked for disposal. Each sale weakened Britain's future ability to pay, rebuild, and compete. But the logic from Washington was mercilessly consistent. If Britain owned valuable property on American soil, then America would not finance its war. Britain must first consume itself. One case became emblematic of the entire process. A massive American industrial corporation, profitable, modern, and strategically important, was majority owned by British capital. It generated millions in annual dividends, dollars that flowed back to London and helped balance Britain's trade deficit. To British officials, this company was a lifeline. To Washington, it was unacceptable. The Treasury demanded its sale. British negotiators resisted. They knew the valuation. They knew that selling under duress would cut the price in half. But resistance meant delay, and delay meant ships sinking, factories idle, and cities starving. The ultimatum was simple. Sell, or the aid dies in Congress. Under extreme pressure, the British government seized the company using emergency wartime powers and placed it on the market. American investment banks handled the transaction. They knew Britain had no bargaining power. They knew time was lethal. The price was driven down aggressively. What was worth over $100 million was sold for roughly half that. The proceeds did not go to rebuild Britain or stabilize its economy. They went directly into the U.S. Treasury to pay American arms manufacturers. Britain reimbursed the original owners in pounds back home, increasing its internal debt while losing its external income. This was not assistance, it was asset stripping. And it sent a clear message through Britain's ruling class. Survival now came at the cost of long-term sovereignty. While financial assets were being dismantled, strategic assets were next. Britain's naval situation was catastrophic. German submarines were strangling Atlantic supply lines. Merchant tonnage was vanishing faster than it could be replaced. Churchill pleaded for destroyers. The United States had dozens of old World War I-era destroyers sitting idle, obsolete by modern standards, of limited value to the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed to transfer 50 of them. But again, nothing was free. The exchange was not military cooperation, it was territorial leverage. In return for these aging ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on British naval and air bases across the Atlantic world. The scale of the trade was staggering. Bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Caribbean, and South America were handed over. These were not symbolic outposts. They were strategic nodes controlling sea lanes, trade routes, and hemispheric defense. In exchange, Britain received vessels that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical liquidation. Britain was trading permanent strategic reach for immediate survival. The empire was pawning its future to stay alive another month. This deal quietly transformed the Atlantic from a British sphere into an American one. Without firing a shot, the United States secured a military footprint that would project power for generations. By early 1941, Britain had been stripped down to essentials. Gold reserves gone, dollar income streams dismantled, strategic territory leased away, the treasury empty. Only then did American aid formally materialize. When the Lend-Lease Act finally passed, it was celebrated publicly as the arsenal of democracy. Trucks, planes, food, oil, and ammunition flowed toward Britain, and without that flow, Britain would not have survived. But behind the speeches and posters, the structure of dependence was already locked in. Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was leverage deferred. Hidden inside the legal language was a clause with consequences far beyond the battlefield. In exchange for aid, Britain agreed to dismantle its system of imperial trade preference after the war. The system had bound the empire together economically, shielding British industry from American competition and guaranteeing markets for British goods. By accepting this condition, Britain agreed to tear down its own economic defenses. The empire would be open to American exporters. British industry would face direct competition from a vastly more productive and untouched American manufacturing base. British negotiators understood the implications. They protested. They warned that it would mean the end of Britain as an independent economic power. But there was no alternative. The bombs were still falling. The ships were still sinking. They signed. From that moment on, the outcome was inevitable. Britain might win the war militarily, but it had already lost the peace economically. The empire would not be conquered by force. It would be dismantled through contracts, clauses, and conditional aid. The war was still raging, but the transfer of global leadership had already begun. The battlefield victory was still ahead. The financial defeat was already sealed. As the war ground on, the balance between Britain and the United States shifted from dependency to dominance. After Pearl Harbor, America formally entered the conflict, and British leaders hoped the relationship would finally become one of equals. Soldiers now fought side by side. American aircraft filled British skies. The island became a massive forward base for U.S. forces preparing to retake Europe. But while the military alliance tightened, the economic gap widened into an abyss. The United States was fighting a global war while growing richer by the year. Britain was fighting the same war while hollowing itself out. American industry exploded. Government contracts poured money into factories that had never seen a bomb. Production lines ran day and night. The United States produced not only tanks, planes, and ships, but also consumer goods for global markets. Radios, refrigerators, machinery, vehicles, and industrial equipment flowed outward. Britain, by contrast, shut down civilian production almost entirely. Every factory was converted to war use. Exports collapsed. Long-standing commercial relationships in Latin America, Asia, and Africa were abandoned because Britain simply could not supply them. Those markets did not disappear. They were filled. American companies stepped in and never left. While British factories built Spitfires exclusively for war, American factories built Spitfires and dominated peacetime commerce at the same time. By 1944, the transformation was complete. The financial center of gravity of the world had moved across the Atlantic. Gold reserves that once anchored London now sat in American vaults. The dollar replaced sterling as the backbone of international trade. Britain was no longer the banker of the world, it was a customer. British officials understood this, but they believed the sacrifice would be rewarded. They believed that because Britain had stood alone in 1940, because it had exhausted its wealth holding the line, the United States would act generously after victory. They assumed Lend-Lease would continue during the transition to peace. They expected time to rebuild. They were wrong. Victory came suddenly. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. Crowds filled the streets of London in celebration. Bonfires burned. The war was over. But in Washington, there was no emotion, only accounting. 7 days after victory celebrations began, the U.S. government terminated Lend-Lease without warning. The cutoff was immediate and absolute. No transition period. No grace. Ships already at sea carrying food and supplies for Britain were ordered to turn around. The flow stopped overnight. The lifeline was severed. The shock in London was total. Britain's entire wartime economy had been structured around Lend-Lease imports. Half the nation's food and nearly all raw materials came from abroad. Without dollars, Britain could not pay. John Maynard Keynes examined the figures and saw a catastrophe. Not a future crisis, but instant bankruptcy. Britain faced what he called a financial Dunkirk. Without emergency funds, imports would stop. Rations would fall to starvation levels. Factories would close for lack of materials. Unemployment would explode. Social collapse was not theoretical. It was imminent. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. In late 1945, Keynes traveled to Washington as chief negotiator. He was ill, exhausted, and nearing the end of his life. But he still believed Britain had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years. It had sacrificed its economy to stop fascism. Keynes argued that the United States should provide a grant, not a loan. A retroactive payment for Britain's sacrifice. He called it justice. The American response was blunt. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. Only a loan on commercial terms with interest. The political climate had changed. American voters were tired of Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, which promised nationalization and social reform. American officials did not want to fund what they saw as a socialist experiment. They knew Britain had no alternatives. The negotiating table was a formality. The loan offered was barely sufficient to prevent starvation, and it came with conditions designed to dismantle what remained of Britain's economic independence. The most dangerous condition was currency convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound freely convertible into dollars. On paper, this sounded like free trade. In reality, it was a trap. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies and trading partners to hold sterling they could not convert. This protected British industry and preserved dollar reserves. Convertibility would shatter that system overnight. Keynes warned that the moment convertibility was introduced, holders of sterling around the world would dump it to obtain dollars. He was right, but refusing the condition meant economic collapse. The British Parliament accepted the loan in 1946, fully aware it was surrendering control. Many compared it to Munich, an act of appeasement driven by desperation. Keynes died shortly after, having spent his final strength trying to soften the terms. His warnings went unheeded. Britain had survived the war. Now it faced the consequences of survival. The battlefield victory was complete. The financial reckoning had only just begun. The reckoning arrived exactly as predicted. In July 1947, under the terms of the Anglo-American loan, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. The switch was thrown with bureaucratic calm, but the effect was immediate and devastating. The world rushed for the exit. Countries that had accumulated sterling during the war moved instantly to exchange it for dollars. Everyone wanted American currency, American goods, American machines. The pound collapsed under the weight of global selling. In a matter of weeks, hundreds of millions of dollars drained from Britain's reserves. The loan that was meant to last years evaporated almost overnight. After just 5 weeks, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. The window was slammed shut. Britain had played by American rules and been crushed by them. The humiliation was complete. The consequences were not confined to finance. They reshaped geopolitics. With the treasury empty and reserves bleeding, Britain could no longer sustain its global commitments. In early 1947, a quiet message was sent to Washington. Britain could no longer afford to support Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. The message was blunt. Britain was withdrawing. If the United States wanted to contain Soviet expansion, it would have to do so alone. This admission triggered the Truman Doctrine. America stepped into the vacuum Britain had occupied for a century. The transfer of global leadership was now official. Britain was no longer a superpower shaping events. It was a regional power struggling to keep its economy functioning. At home, the reality of victory turned bitter. The winter of 1947 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow buried railways and froze coal stockpiles. Power stations shut down. Factories stood idle. Families huddled in unheated homes, lighting candles because electricity failed. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war itself, was rationed in peacetime. The public began to understand the price that had been paid. Britain had won the war, but its standard of living was collapsing. Austerity was not temporary, it was structural. In 1949, the illusion of recovery finally broke. With exports weak and reserves depleted, the government devalued the pound. Before the war, sterling had stood at $4.86. It was cut to $2.80. Overnight, Britain became dramatically poorer relative to the rest of the world. Imports surged in price, living standards fell. The devaluation was not a policy choice, it was an admission of reality. Britain could no longer compete on equal terms with American industry. The empire that once dictated global prices now adjusted to them. Yet the bill did not end in the 1940s. The loan taken to prevent starvation after victory was not symbolic. It was commercial debt, with interest. For decades, Britain paid. Through post-war recovery, through economic crises, through political change, the checks were written year after year to the U.S. Treasury. The final payment was made in December 2006. More than 60 years after the war ended, British taxpayers were still paying for survival. The victory parades were long forgotten, but the debt remained. This is the central myth the story destroys. The wars produce winners. Germany lost and was destroyed. Britain won and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States. Its industry doubled during the war. Its cities were untouched. It held the majority of the world's gold. Through conditional aid, post-war loans, and currency dominance, it dismantled the economic foundations of the British Empire without conquest. The empire was not defeated by armies. It was acquired through contracts, leverage, and enforced openness. For Britain, the psychological impact endured. A sense of decline settled into the national consciousness. The special relationship became a polite phrase masking dependence. When Churchill wrote his letter in December 1940, he saved his country from fascism. But he also initiated a transaction that could not be reversed. Britain traded empire for survival. There was no alternative, but the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant and an economic subordinate. The story of the price of victory is not about betrayal or generosity. It is about power. In modern total war, morality does not cancel accounting. Britain spent its inheritance to defend civilization. It was a noble sacrifice, perhaps the noblest of the 20th century. But in economic terms, it was liquidation. The empire did not fall. It was sold, asset by asset, base by base, clause by clause, to pay the bill for doing the right thing. And that is the truth the archives reveal when the slogans fade and the ledgers remain.